I'm joined by Whidbey Island resident and passionate birder Carlos Andersen. Carlos has spent his entire life immersed in and protecting nature. With a degree in geological sciences, he was drawn to and climbed high mountains around the world, commercially fished for salmon in Alaska, and built backcountry trails and fought forest fires for the National Park Service. His environmental career included responding to hazardous materials emergencies as a first responder across Washington state and cleaned up contaminated sites through the western U.S., Alaska, and the Marshall Islands. He now enjoys a slower pace, being closer to home and enjoying the peace and quiet of nature and birding. Deer Lagoon Preserve soon became a place he knew needed love, attention, and protection. Through his advocacy work for Deer Lagoon Preserve, he hopes to protect and preserve this Whidbey Island treasure for many generations to come. Thank you for being with us, Carlos.
Hey, thank you, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. You're such an awesome person and such a great Whidbey Island resident. Carlos did a bird watching event for Wien last year, which was super awesome. And it was really cool to see you in action with your big lenses and to be, an educator. And so, I'm really looking forward to us having a conversation today about Deer Lagoon Preserve and why it's important and why, Whidbey Island and Island County needs to protect it. But I wanted to start with kind of a general question for you because you're a Washington native. And as a person who came from elsewhere, I'm really curious how the landscape in Washington has changed over the years. What has changed since you were a kid? What has stayed the same? Kind of like looking for your general observations about Washington and your relationship to it.
Yeah, good question. Good lead in there. For me and my family, we were always outdoors and always fishing and being out and about. And so, I'll talk a little, so I'll go straight to kind of like the island piece of it is like we've seen a lot of the rural lands and farmlands kind of, built on, forests have been cut down. We've got a lot more people on island. The ferry lines have, gotten longer, kind of been taking a step back from that and looking at more of out in the national parks and things like that. Trails, national parks are crowded. It's kind of a busy time out there. People are trying to get more nature and get out and about. But, just a lot of, like I say, the forests have been cut down, a lot of change in the overbuilding, overpopulation. Our rural character here on the islands changed quite a bit. A lot more noise, a lot more movement, a lot more ferry lines, things along that. And what's kind of stayed the same, I felt, is the beauty in the Northwest for the most part. Mount Rainier is still out and we see the beauty of our mountains. And also I found that if you head on down the trail about 5 miles, you'll lose 95% of the people that are hanging closer around the trailhead. So those are the things that I've kind of seen as what's changed and what's stayed the same.
It's really interesting that you say that because I think that really speaks to a tension that I experience here, which is that people move here because it's beautiful and they love the nature here. And the more people move here, the more you have to contend with population growth and what that means for nature. Like, I have friends who are backpackers, who that's their thing. They love to do it. And it's really hard to get a permit to backpack these days. It's kind of like a rat race to be able to get a permit to go to some of these places that are beautiful. And it's good to have a permit system in the sense that like it limits the number of people who can go in at a time. But it also, the fact that it's really hard to get one kind of shows you like how many people are trying to go out there and the amount of like human waste that's had to be helicoptered off of like a certain, national parks. You're like, oh, wow. Like even when we're trying to do the right thing, we're like still having impact,
right.
So that's just like an interesting kind of tension, which I think is a tension in land use planning and a tension in like living in a rural area in general is like, how do you keep the beauty and the ecosystem functioning of a rural area while continuing to accommodate, human beings who live there. And I think that we'll get into this a little later because I think that's kind of why Deer Lagoon needs to be seen as a preserve and why the priority needs to be the protection of that place, and the secondary subordinate purpose would be recreation, very light recreation by human beings. But the other thing I know about you, other than you being a Washington native and kind of the general nature of your bio, is that you are a birder, kind of a big birder. Carlos had a newspaper article in the Whidbey News Times that described you as Birdman. So how'd you get into birding?
Yeah, the Birdman thing is kind of funny because the only other Birdman I know is the Birdman from Alcatraz, and that's not a really good story per se. I mean, it's a good story, but actually it's because of the prison there. So it's like, Birdman, ouch, okay, I don't know how to take that. But yeah, so birding, love of nature and love of creatures, out there and stuff. And I probably got into birding maybe when I was working for the Park Service, I would think, because when you're out in we're doing trail crew and fire crew. Mostly on trail crew, you'd have a little time at lunch and stuff underneath the Tarpon Olympic National Park or Grand Canyon National Park. You have an opportunity to sit back and, you learn the stars and the plants and the trees and the animals. And naturally, you learn the birds. It's like, well, what bird is that when you're sitting around? And one of the beautiful things, if anyone ever gets down to the Grand Canyon or Canyon Country, is the canyon wrens. It's such an awesome call that they have. Their song is really beautiful. So it was either that or my folks. I grew up in the Seattle area, and my mom and dad at our house when I was a kid. There used to be a house wren the migratory that would come springtime, and they would pick a little place in a vent that came out of the house made of wood and stuff. But it would go in and make its nest there. And my mom and I thoroughly enjoyed that. So either one of those events, it's probably more, but those are pretty good pieces to start from.
Yeah. I mean, I guess having the time to really having a relationship with it, like I think everyone, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people have a relationship with the birds in their yard. I grew up in New Jersey and my grandma was a birder. And she loved the birds in her backyard. And so it was, we lived in a pretty suburban area. So it wasn't like we had nature like we do out here, but she had such a relationship with those birds, like she had bird houses. She had her whole little bird network that would show up and hang out with her. Cool. And I have my own, I have my own birds here, like I see the regulars, and so it's like a little bird neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sweet part of it, too, during migration. We're just starting into migration. So weekly, new birds are showing up, and this will go on until about mid-May. They're migrating up here to either stay or they're migrating up here and then moving on up towards Alaska, British Columbia, where they go up and breed and have their young. And so that's the cool piece is through the wintertime, we kind of have the same old little brown jobs, we call them LBJs. Yeah. And now though, you look at your bird feeder and stuff and new birds are showing up almost every day, and it's really fun.
Do you have a way that you track your sightings? Like, how do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a book that I write things in so I can kind of track dates and things like that. I'm not super, super stuck on that, but as birders, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is like, most of us are listers, or many of us are listers, and we keep a list of, I went to Amanda's house and this is the birds I saw, and I went over to Jesse's house and we made a list over there. But, and most of it, I try to put it into eBird. When we took our walk out at Deer Lagoon Preserve, my intention is to I love getting people on new birds they've never seen before. It's so exciting. And, for myself as well, to see that new bird for the first time, it's just, they call it a lifer. It's so exciting to see something new.
Yeah. What has been your favorite bird sighting?
Well, let's see. My favorite bird sighting. Locally, it's the short-eared owls. I love the short-eared owls. They're so beautiful. Crocker Lake has a bunch of those. Deer Lagoon Preserve will also get some come through in the wintertime, and then in the north they head up a little bit higher, a little bit further north. I love pelicans. I love penguins actually has always been a love of mine, and puffins. And we did a trip to Iceland one time and just saw tons of puffins. So it was cool. But one of the really exciting sightings I had was in Arizona. outside of the short-eared owls here, or burrowing owls, which is more eastern Washington, was something called an elegant trogon. And, like I said, when you see something for the first time, you kind of know its call. So you listen for the call. And this is in southeastern Arizona. And man, once you hear the call and then you finally track it down, it's like, where is it? It was a pretty tame, not a crazy bird. It kind of had this bark like a dog, and beautiful bird, absolutely beautiful. And it comes up from Mexico and hangs out in southeast Arizona for a while and then goes back down. But yeah, that was probably one of my more exciting ones. It's kind of hard to dial that in, like your favorite bird, but those are really memorable.
What was that? What was the one that you saw in southeast Arizona? What was it called again?
It's called an elegant trogon.
Elegant trogon. What does it look like?
So it's got really, it's kind of reddish. It's got it's kind of like if you look at the Anna's hummingbirds, that iridescent green. It's got that green on it, and then it's got, red on its front, some white and various other colors. It's probably about the size, a little bit bigger than a robin with a pretty long, green tail sticking out the back, and it's got that funny bark. So it's just, all these birds are beautiful, really, and that just stands out. It just pops when you're walking around looking for it.
That's cool. So you're from the Seattle area. Mm-hmm. You live on Whidbey Island. When did you move to Whidbey, and when did you first discover Deer Lagoon?
I probably got to Whidbey. I've been here about 30 years now, and actually came because I got a job with the health department prior to going somewhere else. But I stayed. I mean, once I moved on to other work, this was still my home base, even though my work was off island. Discovering Deer Lagoon was probably right around, I'd say around 2010. It turned into a preserve. It got purchased by the county around 2004, I believe. And when I got involved, it was a little bit, more like with this management plan and things like that. It wasn't around COVID time, around 2020, where we saw stuff that we're just like, wow, this needs to be addressed. There's things going on here. How can we help the county, protect, preserve, and restore this place? Yeah.
I mean, Deer Lagoon, for anyone listening who lives on Whidbey Island, Deer Lagoon is, at least the access point that I access is off of Millman Road is it technically in Freeland or is it in Langley?
I think that's Langley. Yeah, at the end of Deer Lagoon Road.
Yeah, so like Millman Road in Langley, and it's Deer Lagoon Road. Is that the point, like the road that you go off of, and then you can like park and then access the trail. Right. And it is a really beautiful place to walk. And when I worked at Hedgebrook, which is on Millman Road, I used to walk there every day during lunch. And so like, I that's how I discovered Deer Lagoon, was that I, worked at a place where I could see the lagoon. And then I was like, oh, I could walk there, and then, would walk out, and it was always filled with all kinds of interesting, beautiful birds. That was really the thing, is like, and I'm not a birder. I appreciate birds, but I'm not, mostly because I don't create lists, right? Like, I feel like part of being a birder is you cross over into being a birder when you're like, I'm going to start writing this down and I'm going to start seeking out birds.
It's when you buy your first bird book, and it's like, oh, look, I need, and then all of a sudden it's like, it kind of cascades, oh, I need another bird book, and I need, if you look through my bookshelf, I probably, you probably don't want to do that. I'm going to bet 20 to 30 different type of bird books.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. But I, even as a person who maybe doesn't have 20 or 30 bird books, I could appreciate that there were really interesting, cool birds at Deer Lagoon.
Yeah.
And so I know that that Deer Lagoon has cool, interesting birds. So do I. But the Whidbey, and I guess the Washington Audubon Society also has designated Deer Lagoon as an important bird area. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of wondering if you could explain to people what makes Deer Lagoon a special bird area.
Right. So it's an IBA, or an important bird, not birding, but bird area. Birding would mean it was about you and me and people birding that makes it cool for us, but really it's an important bird area. So it's important for the birds. For the birds, for that to get that designation from the kind of it's the state up to the national Audubon, that it trickles down from its international program, I believe, that you have to have certain things that make it safe for birds, that they have an opportunity to feed, have shelter, be safe, and raise young. So all those, there's a number of criteria that you have to be an IBA. And so that's the cool piece about that, is that at Deer Lagoon, it's really, and this is what makes Deer Lagoon so unique, is that there's basically, because you've been there, as we walk out initially, it's a forested area. So there's different birds in different areas. You don't find a mallard, which you probably could see a couple walking on the trail that came out of the water nearby. But for the most part, the forest has specific birds, woodpeckers, things along those lines, pine siskins, things. So you find that in the wooded area. Then you get down, as down where the sign opens up on the dikes, you have a marsh area on your left, a marsh area on your right, and the tidelands on your left. And so now you're crossed over into there's three habitats there. You get a little bit further out, there's more in that wetland cattail area towards the houses, and then you look out into the salt water. So you've got 4 or 5 habitats right next to each other, with some crossover between birds in those different areas. And it's awesome, if you want to do a bird count, because it's not just the waterfowl birds or the wetland birds or the marsh birds, tideland birds that are out there, which is most of the peeps or the shorebirds that we see. It's like you've got all this going on, and it's really fun because it's extremely interesting. And you can walk away after a short walk, 50 different species, of birds. So that's really why it's such a unique and special place.
That makes a lot of sense to talk about it in terms of how there are a lot of habitats happening in a very close environment.
Right.
And it's interesting because Deer Lagoon is 370, it's 374 or 5.
79. Yeah, 79. Right.
379 acres, but we only see as human beings, because there's, for people who haven't been there, as Carlos mentioned, you kind of walk on the trail and there's a wooded forested area, and then it opens up and then you're on a spit or a dike, and there are two trails that you can walk on. One of them leads out to the beach, right? And the other one leads kind of dead ends at the end with a private road. Mm-hmm. But so you're walking along, and it's not a long walk, for us, but there's 379 acres available to birds in that particular area. And as you said, I guess 4 or 5 different types of habitat with overlapping birds. And so the kind of biodiversity that's possible there is really high. And I know that every year the Whidbey Audubon Society does a Christmas bird count, and that you have been a part of the Christmas bird count at Deer Lagoon. And so I'm wondering if you know the numbers from last year, or what the count was for that.
Yeah, so we were I don't think we broke the record last year because it was actually pretty windy. So it's always a crapshoot, coming around wintertime. New Year's is when you actually end up doing it, somewhere right before or after Christmas. So the weather doesn't necessarily, cooperate all the time. I think we're around 60 to 70 birds down there for that time of year when we did the count this year, which is really good. I mean, you miss out on a lot of them. It's amazing how many birds you don't find. If we were in Texas, we'd probably be getting a couple hundred birds, because that's where all the migratory birds have gone. Yeah. We got the leftovers that hung out through the wintertime. But yeah, we had about 60 to 70 birds on the Christmas bird count, which is basically, you can run it 24 hours if you want. We do it mostly during daylight hours.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. And some of the things that so I guess, okay, so we have these multiple habitats in this 379 acre area. There are a lot of different birds, and this place is a important bird area, not an important birding area, an important bird area for the birds, right. Because it meets criteria for their safety and for their well-being through the duration, I guess, of their life cycle, right? And
for survival.
Yeah. And so, that's special. And it also is interesting to think about in terms of, climate change and how climate change has impacted bird populations at Deer Lagoon, because, I know that like we have kind of a famous group of pelicans that have shown up at the lagoon pretty recently. And that is in part because they lost other habitat elsewhere. And so I'm wondering if you kind of talk about that and kind of talk about how climate change has impacted the bird populations at Deer Lagoon.
Yeah, good question. I really do believe, talking to some of our other birders, to me, it does feel like we're seeing less birds out there. And so that's what's really interesting you wonder about what's going on with the big picture. There's a study was done a little while ago, and it was a 50-year study. And through that time period, they came up with 2 to 3 billion birds were lost during that time period between Canada and the US. That's about, and this is what blows me away, 60 million, average it out, 60 million birds a year disappeared, are gone in the US and Canada, which is about the population of Italy, which is just mind-boggling for me, because to think of that loss of that many birds through different things, and so to answer the climate change things, we don't really know if it's climate change, or loss of habitat or use of pesticides. The avian flu, the avian flu hit really, really hard a couple of years back, and that took out all kinds of different wildlife, and birds being part of that wildlife. So that was interesting to see that. The pelicans come in about, it's exciting too. It's about March. They come in and then they'll run till the fall, probably till October. They came in 2014, and kind of the theory was they were climate refugees, that the area where they were down in Oregon put them dried up. And so now the predators, the coyotes or whatever, could walk out to these mounds where they, in the past, had been protected by water around, so they could have their, nests and things on those mounds or in that land surface. And so now with that being dry, the animals can get out there, predators can come in. And so they apparently have pushed north. They tried to get established up around Anacortes. That didn't work, for various reasons, because of human impacts, fireworks and things like that. And so I think we have one colony down on the Columbia River, 1 or 2, and they're in Eastern Washington, kind of during the off season. They'll head out, like I said, probably in latter September or so. But those are, kind of, it's interesting with the impacts too, because, with sea level rise, you get more at the entrance. There's been some concerns that some citizens, community members have brought up. There's cells of, the way it's longshore current. And so all the sand coming off Double Bluff comes from the west over to the mouth of Deer Lagoon. And it meets up with another cell that's pushing sediment from the south. And I know you guys have worked tons on the armoring of the beaches and things like that, which changes this sediment flow back and forth up and down the beach. And so, we're kind of keeping an eye on that a little bit. The tides in the water is so strong and so high now, we have those king tides, that it still flushes out Deer Lagoon proper. So maybe I should clarify, there's Deer Lagoon, that's county owned, which is to the west, and you take, and to the right is the open Deer Lagoon that's open to the tidal influences, saltwater. There's basically 3 dikes out there that were put in long time ago to try to make for farming. If you dry things up, you can farmland, and obviously that didn't work super good. But half of the Deer Lagoon that is tidally influenced, half to the east is state park. And then everything from the middle of that Deer Lagoon piece all the way over to Double Bluff Road, that's county owned. And so that's where this tidally influenced piece is half and half, state parks and county. And that seems to get flushed really well. But we have seen orange tide or Noctiluca tides that are indicative of contaminants. And that's a concern, because everything from the upland area flows down into that area, into Deer Lagoon and out. And so even off the golf course comes down, pumped in. So that's a huge concern, as failed septic systems, people washing their cars, everything from the highlands ends up in Deer Lagoon.
Yeah, you just started talking about this, but I'm kind of this kind of flowed naturally into what are the kind of hazards and human impacts that are possible at Deer Lagoon right now. Like one of the things you mentioned was the golf course. And I know that you and I had discussed this when we were actually out at Deer Lagoon, that you guys were doing some type of testing. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so as you look at a nature preserve, you want to like, what are the areas of contaminants? What are the areas of concern? How can you best take care of this incredibly, beautiful place that's an Island County gem? And so, you look at pesticides are known, pesticides and fertilizers are known contaminants that come off of, golf, they're used and come off of in the surrounding areas off the golf courses. But that also feeds into, like I said, to the septic systems and to if you wash your car, the heavy metals, just driving around. If there's any fuel tanks that are left over historically, those can leak petroleum in. That's the beauty of having the marsh, which is on the west side of Deer Lagoon. And that's the wetlands are natural filtration, components of nature that it does an incredible job. But so the testing that we did, we don't have any results back yet. We put the cage, so we had mussels that are indicative. They're using them all over the Northwest. It's a Fish and Wildlife project. And they take those mussels, we put them in the cage we put it out in latter November, pulled it out latter January, so about 2 months. They got beat up pretty good. We actually got out there to try to grab it at low tide, and it had moved a pretty good distance. We had a number of times it had been, checked on and been moved and pushed around. The tides and the energy of the waves in that area is really something. The levels of water, and this is what blew me away, is where we put the cage. I think part of our group, we decided it must be about 15 feet under or 20 feet underwater at high tide. So that's like, and then when it drains the lagoon, all the contaminants kind of filter through and come through these mussels, and the mussels are from Penn Cove, and they're filter feeders. So through this study from Fish and Wildlife, they've used them, the mussels, as a really good indicator of contaminants due to that filtering. But we don't have results yet, but it's a really good start.
Yeah. Okay. So you guys put mussels in cages out on the lagoon to kind of get a sense of whether or not there are contaminants in the water, because mussels are because they're a filter, they will absorb or kind of contain whatever contaminants are in the water is kind of the idea. Okay. And you said the Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing this like all over?
Yeah, it's their program, but they engage local people like Audubon,
like a project by project thing where they'll partner with a group to kind of do a project.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and they're kind of like heading it up, but it really does trickle down mostly to a lot of the locals, like WSU, everybody, shoreline stewards, and everybody like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so you guys are waiting for results. Do you know how long it'll take for you to get results back?
No, I think that Linda Rose is in charge of this. She's a former NOAA person and a great resource. PhD. She was going to go down, and I haven't talked to her for a little bit now, so I'm going to check in with her. But yeah, I don't know how long it takes to run through the testing, because there's so many sites across Washington State, within Puget Sound, that I'm sure it's a big lift to try to get all this done.
Yeah, well, it's good to know it's Linda Rhodes, because maybe we could have her on and talk about it later, because she's already been on this podcast.
Oh, cool. Yeah, she's awesome. She is awesome. She is.
Yeah, but so you love Deer Lagoon. You're part of the Audubon Society, and we just started talking about like the ways in which Audubon is trying to make sure that there aren't contaminants at Deer Lagoon. But the reason why I asked you on this podcast is because you wrote the Deer Lagoon Management Plan, which is a document that I have right next to me on my desk, which is 92 pages long and is a comprehensive plan for how Island County could choose to, manage Deer Lagoon as a preserve with the protection of the wildlife and habitat in mind. And so I am curious how you ended up writing this plan. how did this happen? How did you become the guy?
It's funny how you become the guy, the person, the guy or the gal.
Person. Yeah,
the person, because it's funny, once you start doing a little bit of research, all of a sudden you become the expert, and it's like, it's crazy, right? How it all started was, around COVID, like I mentioned, people wanted to come up to the island, and, because we were non-mask, we didn't have the mask requirement as they did in the city. So a lot of people come up and hit the lagoon, be outside, because everybody's restricted being inside so much that they wanted to be outside. And so nature is just huge for, the health benefits of it. And so people were taking advantage of that. And so we were down at Deer Lagoon, and we saw over time a number of things: dogs off leash, poop all over, just all kinds of use and abuse and overuse, and actually some trees were being cut down by some, that we surmised this, but I'm sure it was some homeowners that had somebody go out into the wetlands to start cutting trees down to improve their view to the west. And so that was the start of all this. And so, rose the flag up, the concern with that, and kind of had a number of meetings with the county, mostly Public Works, because Public Works and Parks, and it's kind of convoluted, but Parks is part of Public Works. So I'm just going to say Public Works owns it. Management kind of falls, I think, under Parks, but that's still kind of a gray area that they're clarifying. I think that they finally have decided that Parks does have the management piece of it. But, they bought it in 2004, and it was 20, we're 22 years into that. And there's been basically no management or anything that's been done. Very, very little. I think around 2020, 2021, they took the gates down and they put in the bollards at Deer Lagoon Road entrance at that trailhead, but nothing else really was ever done. And so I started digging a little bit and doing the research, and realized that, there needed to be some sort of an official, bigger management plan than what kind of came out in the executory deed of trust. That has a real minimal language management plan in that, or guidance, but nothing that really looked like anything that Deer Lagoon could really use. So went out with the Public Works director, walked out there, and it's one of the previous Public Works directors, and talked with him about things. And he said, we just don't have the staff time or the money to do it. That's like $100,000 project. We don't have that kind of money. And I'd offered up, I'd volunteered. Well, I could probably write one and give it to the county. And either that conversation or one shortly thereafter. And he was like, "You said you could write it. Write it. That'd be great. Could you write it?" Like, oh, okay. And so I kind of, I felt I could probably do it. I didn't think I'd have a problem compiling the information, but it kind of grew pretty big, and I'm pretty detail oriented. And so, my work became, a lot of research for a couple of years, and then trying to compile it in this plan. Luckily, the Whidbey Communal Land Trust was awesome. Ryan was fantastic, and Powell were great and really, really helpful. They shared some of their boilerplates. They actually wrote the plan for Barnum Point County Park, which actually they either gave to the county as is, or they gave the county in draft form. And it got, at least they took it on. I'm not sure where that is, if they adopted it totally or what they did with it. But that's kind of how, surprisingly, and we were going to try to do as Whidbey Audubon, but talking to the president then, she told me that, boy, our plate is totally jammed. We don't have the time or staff either. So if you want to take it on, go for it, and, to try to help us, they could a little bit here and there, but mostly that's, I saw the need. I knew where it was going, looking at all the abuses and all the degradation that was taking place. And it's like, I've seen it before. It's just a matter of time before it kind of, that snowball gets out of control. And I felt that somebody needed to do something. And, I was retired. So it's like, well, let's take this on. And it actually became pretty all consuming for sure.
Never underestimate the power of a retired individual on Whidbey Island. I have to say.
Yeah. No kidding.
I've never seen such an active group of people with so much knowledge and expertise and passion and energy, like
Right.
truly. And so I think it's also, I think you taking on this project to me is the ultimate expression of what local community activism can look like and environmental activism can look like. And we really know that like where the rubber meets the road is the implementation of policy. And this is where, you know, you really set up a wonderful plan. One of the things that you mentioned very briefly when when describing how you got into this was that there's a deed, right? And I think one of the things that I know a little bit about, but you know more about, is that when this land was acquired by the county, it involved certain doing certain things. Like there are certain requirements that they had to meet in order to do that. And that there was a grant that was given to them. And that, you know, one of the terms of that was that this would be a preserve. Isn't that true?
Yeah. The money, actually, Patty Murray was awesome too. She started the first seed money coming through. She got an appropriation, I think, congressional appropriation or some sort of funding that I think might have been about $1 million that started this thing out, that started in the right direction. And then the county applied for a Fish and Wildlife Wetlands coastal grant and got that. And yeah, within that, so it's called the executive interest. Let's see. I'll have to look that up. It's executive interest.
Deed of executory interest.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so the whole deal is that dictates how things are supposed to be handled at Deer Lagoon Preserve. And it's protect, preserve, and restore is kind of the language that's within that. And it's for fish and wildlife. You know, there's always been this huge, focus on salmon and stuff. And those dikes really kind of mess things up. For the salmon to have, you know, this flushing in and out, but actually that kind of helps the birding piece of it because it does give us those four, at least it probably gives us, if you took them out, you probably only have, you know, one or two less habitats. But through that whole process, it's for fish, you know, it's for specifically for fish and wildlife habitat with recreation. It's passive management and passive recreation. And recreation is only a second thought after the main focus, which is to protect, preserve, and restore fish and wildlife habitat. And so that's always been a bit of an issue because we always talk to people about, it's like, man, if it's a real true preserve, then maybe dogs should not be out here. Maybe these kite surfers should not be out here. You know, and I know there's so many other places to have that recreation, jogging, e-bikes, things like that, that it's really important, I think, and this is the way I looked at it, it's not my opinion or anyone else's, what got written into the plan was based on those requirements that the county is obligated to and agreed to in that grant application and in the grant the order that's in there.
This plan is trying to help bridge the gap between the promise that was made and the current use. This is in the deed of executory interest. Activities appropriate for the property are A, passive management of the property to maintain its long-term natural function for fish and wildlife habitat value and benefits. Note, passive does not include such activities as haying of the land to increase game species population numbers, grazing, or other wetland impacting activities. Restoring the land to natural habitat conditions by removing human structures, materials, and waste. Sustain current wetland conditions by retaining height of water levels behind the dike, or at some future time restore the historic intertidal wetland system. Vegetation management of exotic species, such as reed canary grass, purple loosestrife, etc., and subsequent revegetation with native wetland species. Passive recreational opportunities, which might include but are not limited to nature walks, environmental education. This may include a small parking area on the upland portion of the southwest corner of the site, provided 1, it is consistent with the terms of the original grant agreement, and 2, is adequately buffered to prevent impact up to the wetland itself. And I think that that's, the vision, Carlos's vision in this document is, quote, Deer Lagoon Preserve is a healthy and safe nature sanctuary for fish and wildlife and a refuge for people seeking quiet respite and enjoyment in nature. And so that's kind of, very holistic, very chill, also still doesn't, you're not telling people they can't see it or be there. You're just saying like that, not that first, right? The primary purpose is to protect, preserve, and where appropriate, restore the ecological health and resilience of Deer Lagoon. Right. And, I do think that it's interesting because you and I both know that the county commissioners had a meeting about this plan and about the potential of using this plan as a framework for a plan that they could adopt. I don't think anyone is suggesting that they just blindly adopt your plan, but you did do a lot of work, a lot of detail-oriented expert work with partners, which included the Public Works Department, which included the Whidbey Communal Land Trust, which included other, experts in the field of preservation, conservation, and management. And so, it was cool to hear in the conversation, Commissioner St. Clair talk about there being an entire designation within the comprehensive plan in the parks element for preserves. That Deer Lagoon Preserve is a preserve and it deserves this protection and this management. So do other preserves, in Island County. But with the idea that a preserve is its primary purpose, is the preservation of the place. And, as we said earlier in this conversation, part of the reason why that's so important for Deer Lagoon in particular is because it's an important bird area. It has, it's special for birds. It has habitat that can't be found elsewhere. Literally, there are, birds migrating here because it's one of their last places that they can go to on their migratory route. And so, it is really, I think it's critical at this juncture to put in the work to actually adopt either your plan or a plan that uses all of your all of your ideas so that it can really happen. And so I'm wondering if you could explain to people what the pillars of conservation are in your plan. Like, what is it, in terms of like the framework for what conservation preservation would look like? What does that look like for Deer Lagoon under the plan that you wrote?
Yeah, it's pretty much our mantra, which was protect, preserve, and restore. We started with that, and that's what it states in the plan. And we look at that, and that's the main pieces is that they, I know that the county, and you talked about the commissioners, and I'm just thrilled that Commissioner St. Clair brought that up, about preserves, because, I know you and I have talked about this, and a lot of other folks trying with the comp plan. It just, it was really, Parks was really focused on recreation, and given that language that's in that deed of executory interest, it states that it's not about recreation. It is about fish and wildlife habitat. So that's the really interesting part. But I think it's, the main conversation, well, maybe what I should say is what it would look like would be, parks are for recreation and preserves are for nature, and just let nature be nature. Just let it be, there's really, how it is in life. If we try to help something, as humans, it always many times will screw things up. It doesn't make it better. Nature probably knows a lot better than we do, So the conservation piece would just. I know they've talked about part of that deed actually has in it kind of a boardwalk that comes in off of over by Double Bluff County Park and the parking over there and things like that. And I think that really. That's grown on me a little bit. It's like maybe I could get behind that, because that would get kids and other people out in different areas, not real far out into the wetlands, but it'll open up that west side where you talked about 379 acres, where really there's only a small area. And you can only go down to the end, partly down the way on the dikes before you run into private property. So it's kind of limited. There's only those two trails. So I think that boardwalk would be incredible to put it in, and funding and all that kind of stuff is always an issue. But I think there had been tons of grants out. I know things have changed at the federal level for things like that.
The boardwalk is a cool idea, because I think I mentioned to you the last time we spoke that when I was a kid, I grew up by the Meadowlands in New Jersey, and one of the most significant ecological experiences as a child with birds and with wetlands was being able to go out on the boardwalk in the middle of the wetlands. But
it's very clear. It was very clear to me at the time, and it was very clear in the setup of that place that I was in their house. That like I was experiencing a habitat as an observer, as a guest, as a, as a kid, you knew that. You knew by the way they designed the boardwalk. The boardwalk was very small. It was not the lowest possible impact. It was almost like a single file experience, like that you weren't there to like use it heavily. You were there to have the opportunity to experience nature as it is without you.
Right.
Really, and so I think that would be a really cool and interesting educational experience for people, without it being like a high traffic area. Because as you said about, parks, and the difference between a park and a preserve is that the primary purpose of a preserve is the protection, preservation, and restoration of the habitat of that area. The primary purpose of a park is recreation, right?
Right.
And so to be able to kind of make the preservation and protection of habitat a priority while still allowing access, I think would fulfill the vision of the deed and the vision of the grant that was given, right? Like, and that's what your plan says. That's literally it. It's like primary purpose to protect, preserve, and where appropriate, restore the ecological health and resilience of Deer Lagoon Preserve to mitigate the impacts of climate change and ensure beneficial habitat for the fish and wildlife that depend on the preserve for survival. Subordinate purpose to provide walking trails for people to enjoy nature in a quiet setting and pursue passive uses that do not disturb the ecological features of the preserve, such as walking, photography, and other forms of passive art and wildlife viewing. When we're talking about this idea of preserves, and we're talking about Deer Lagoon in particular, and we're talking about this plan that you spent all this time writing, what would your hope and dream be for this? Like, for this plan in the next year or 2 years, like what would be the ideal outcome for you?
So just to touch on one other little piece is that Deer Lagoon doesn't have to be, this is the recreation preserve saying, Deer Lagoon does not have to be all things for all people. And that's what the problem was, is I know the community around there is not happy because they've had free full access since 2004 when the gates were up and the no trespassing signs were up. And so, I know that's kind of hard. There may be some hard decisions to be made, but I think in the county, working with the county, trying to work with the county, trying to give them, the reasoning to do whatever it is that they need to do. They just need to follow what that deed of executory interest says and the conditions of the grant. That, it's not that they get a choice of what they want to do out there. They need to look at that. And that's really, I think, an awesome guiding document, which I tried to, integrate into the plan, the draft plan. I always call it a draft that I put in there. My dream would be that it's protected, preserved at the highest level possible, that preserves are written into code. And what that means is a preserve in code, that you can do this, this, and this, but you can't do this, this, and that. Before any projects or anything's done out there, it's reviewed. The county had gone out, as they always had done, it had gone out and mowed, habitat. And unfortunately, when we got involved, that was somewhere around COVID time, as they'd gone out and they'd mowed habitat at the height of breeding season. And there's tons of ground breeding birds, that have their eggs there and stuff like that. So it totally obliterated that. So my hope would be that, it gets the love and the protection that it needs and that it deserves. Like I said, the county's been pretty hands off, and that's part of what the deed says. It's passive management, but management does include, and what I wrote in the plan, funding should not be too difficult, is get a warden or a ranger that would actually be able to be out there and educate and work with people and work with groups. Whidbey Audubon has taken on, they have adopted a park and been accepted to adopt that as their park. So local groups are, able to come in and gives us a little more, leeway of what we can do. But my hope would be, I'd really like to see kids, educational pieces where they bring a small van out of kids from the school that are in some outdoor class and, hand out the binoculars and let's go find some pelicans, kids, and just, get them excited, get them fired up, because, the kids are our future. But my really big hope would be that we can protect and preserve Deer Lagoon. It's such an awesome place. That's why I felt we needed to step up when we did. Actually, we were probably a little bit late, but to try to stop these tree cutting and, all the other abuses that we're seeing against the wildlife and the birds. And so my hope is that we get it the best. We don't love it to pieces like our national parks. People are really going there, but just people can find refuge there. They can find peace and quiet. They can enjoy nature in whatever form that is for them, and that we can protect and preserve this for generations to come.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that we have a really good opportunity right now to adopt a plan like this and to also adopt a larger framework for preserves in the comprehensive plan because of where we are at right now in the planning cycle for the next 20 years. It would be an ideal time to adopt this plan or a version like this plan of your draft, because it's a draft, and then to have a larger framework for preservation, for other preserves in the county too. To circle back, you mentioned a couple of recreational things that you don't think should be included in this plan. And I actually wanted to talk with you about that a little bit, including walking dogs. And so I kind of would love if you could explain what activities you think should not be allowed in the preserve, and then why. Like, how does that impact the habitat? How does that impact the birds? Why should they not be included?
That's if you go to the Whidbey Audubon site, it shows a lot of those, and it's kind of self-explanatory on some of those. I think the biggest thing is dogs. I think that it's come a long, long ways from when we initially started this process, where people are much better at picking up the dog waste and things like that. The county needs to step up, maybe have a receptacle at the end, the road, and then those are some of the deals. Like, the neighbors have been awesome down there because they get hit pretty hard with people parking on the sides of the road. There potentially be porta potties or things like that. And the dog pieces too it's really interesting doing a lot of research that two people walking has less impact than a dog on leash. A dog on off leash has much more impact because it's this predator prey kind of a deal, to where all the animals, the wildlife out there, the birds, they know that this predator dog, based on historic, the way they're wired and genetically, the way they're wired historically, is that the dog, coming from the lineage of a wolf, is a predator. And so well before a dog on a leash with a human gets to where that bird is, that bird could be on a nest, or that bird is resting, feeding, that's close along the trail and the dikes, and it will bail, it will take off, because again, it's worried about its life. Some people love seeing their dog run into all the gulls or whatever on the beach, or all the birds, sandpipers and sanderlings, all the peeps, that are on this long migration and depend on this gas station of, Deer Lagoon to like fuel up before they continue their, thousands of mile trip north. Some people think it's great, and I love dogs, but they think it's great to have their dog run into and spook all these birds up into the air, and that uses up all their energies. It's really precious energies and waste of energy to flee. They're fleeing for their life. They don't know that dog's having fun. It's like the dog has the chase kind of mechanism where you throw a ball or a stick, and it's the same with, hey, this is fun, and, chase the birds. But it's, the birds are not having a good time out of that. So that's, again, even the dogs with the dog waste out there, like I said, people are doing a much, much better job than they have been in the, years past. But even if they go out and, they marking their territory or their scent will last a long time. It's not just the birds, you've got otters, river otters, we've got beaver, you have all kinds of different wildlife that's out there. And so they all can smell and sense that, and they will vacate and stay away from a certain area for, a number of days or weeks after that, because of the fear of, there's been a predator here. So that's one of the things with the dogs The kite surfers, the windsurfers, that looks like a heck of a fun time. But being inside of the lagoon during, so you're not going to have a kite surfer, windsurfer out there until there's a high wind event. And so at that point in time, the birds are pretty restricted where they have to come into a safe, place to kind of, get out of the wind. And they're very vigilant because they can get picked off by the peregrine falcons or other birds, predators that come in. So again, it's a survival thing. And when you have, you look at a person on a board coming at you at about 30 miles an hour, you don't really know what it is. It's I haven't interviewed a bird recently, but, they interpret it as being a predator because of that big tail and this big thing coming at you, or even as a human form. And so, those birds have to take flight. This thing comes at them. And so, that's, again, they're using up precious resources, energy resources to get out of the way. Instead of hunkered in and staying warm and getting out of the weather, they have to take off. And once you get in the air, they can get picked off by a predator. So there's that. Any petroleum boat, even other boats that come in will change. Say it's a kayak or a canoe, that's going to change the behavior of the birds that are in there. It's changing their natural behaviors. And that's not good. Paddle boards, things like that. A petroleum boat, people come in on the Deer Lagoon side and put the crab pots out, and then come back over on the private side or the state park side and put it on the beach. A petroleum spill would be absolutely devastating in the Deer Lagoon, anywhere where it hits water, but especially Deer Lagoon. People love getting their crab and things like that. I was told, especially as a hazmat spill responder, that the minute a drop, even a sheen, a drop of petroleum hits water, damage is being done. So, those e-bikes are just crazy. You've got birds that'll come. Birds pick up stones in the middle of the trail for their survival, and their gizzards who try to work through food and things like that. Oh. And you got people that are flying through with e-bikes, and I almost got run over once. I was barely able to step back from my, scope that you saw, get out of the way. This person was coming at me about 25 to 30 miles an hour on that road, which is just not, as a preserve, I feel that we really need to look at that. It's a preserve. It's not a recreation place. So that, riding bikes, maybe if people walked them through there, that would be great. But other than that, there's some sort of disruption that we do all the time, as people, and even birders. I get it, but we're a little less impactful as some of these other activities.
Right. It's about like mitigating the impact, trying to lessen the impact. I think, as you're talking about this, I'm just thinking about like how, the definition of sanctuary, right. And how like if this place is a sanctuary for habitat, if the reason why, birds are coming here and otters and other places, because they like need the rest, they need to refuel. You'd mentioned it as a gas station, right? And like the idea that like, birds that are on a migratory route need places to stop and rest. And if this is a stopping and resting place, but they can't rest because there's this perceived threat of predators, right? Mm-hmm. Whether, and it doesn't matter if it's real or not. Although I would say a dog off leash with a high prey drive is a predator. My parents have a bird dog. She's got a high prey drive. She's literally, that's what she's designed for, is to, So I think that like that idea, like even that, like, like dogs relieving themselves, like gives a sense of even if they're not there, that there's this like perceived threat, and it's difficult to relax and recharge when you have a perceived threat. I'm even just thinking about that, like in my own home, right? Like the idea that like I live, my home is my sanctuary. So what if I had the smell of a perceived, predator all over my house? I'd be really terrified. You know what I mean? Right. Or like there's somebody zooming around on an e-bike in my living room. Like it would be horrible.
Right. It's kind of like you sit down for dinner. You've had a long day at work, man. You've been your feet, and you sit down and you're getting ready to eat, and all of a sudden the front door opens up and a bunch of goats come running through, or or somebody on their e-bike, like you said, comes running through.
All of a sudden there's a kite surfer, like it's like, wow, it's like not.
Yeah, and it's just dogs, animals, if they're treated like they should be treated. Domestic dogs will go home and have a nice warm place and food bowls set out and water and taken really good care of. And, I feel so much for these birds because some of them travel thousands of miles, and it's a struggle in the weather and struggle with the predators. And every night they got to find, out there in the woods, try to find a place to, be safe and get out of the way. And then you have to try to raise a family. That's what they do. They feed and then they raise a family. And so, if there's dogs along that grassy strips along the trails and things like that, running around in there and chasing birds or chasing chicks, they will. I've heard so many times that, little, Fido wouldn't hurt a flea. It's like, they just probably haven't seen it. Most dogs have that prey instinct, predator instinct to where, what we see, yeah, that dog is great. But once it gets in game on mode with animals and stuff like that, it really does click a different switch.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me to restrict that access and to really, if you really think of Deer Lagoon as a sanctuary for the wildlife, then you're like, well, then their needs need to be prioritized over the needs of everybody else.
Yeah, and absolutely.
So, yeah. How would you say right now the Whidbey community could support the preservation of Deer Lagoon? What are action steps that you think that community members could take to be a part of this campaign to really protect and preserve this special place?
I think I'll be talking to, I believe, the colony here in a while too, to share some of that information with them as well, to try to really get them engaged, because it is right in their backyard, and hopefully they understand, what it is and kind of the reason it got established and why they're potentially have some rules that are going to be coming along. Because, people, when it first got bought and people had access out there, whether it's the colony or the community or other people that are nearby, is with no guidance, you have a tendency to do what you want at some point in time. And so just for the community to realize that there probably, hopefully, will be some changes that come, and it may change how they are able to interact and use Deer Lagoon out there. But there's so many other places, like if you wanted to walk dogs or do other things or work out, there's other places nearby that people could utilize that, and that this is such a unique and important place. It's not a common spot. I mean, I cannot think of another place has those 4 or 5 different habitats, and it is such a unique spot and deserves protecting, preserving anywhere on the island that has the same kind of a setup with the habitats. So just the upland, if they live in the upland, watershed areas, just kind of think about, chemicals and what they use and things like that, and support the county, support getting a ranger or a warden out there, doing more water sampling. This is just a tiny step for that water sampling. We try to work with the county before. They just, as the county just doesn't have the money or the personnel to really take these things on. So it becomes smaller groups like ourselves, and that would be something in the community. They could set up something, or they could join Whidbey Audubon and become part of this Protect a Park and be part of that team, and that would be awesome.
Is there anything else you think people should know about Deer Lagoon, about the Deer Lagoon Management Plan, about the Whidbey Audubon Society, about birding, anything?
Yeah. I think the most important piece is the plan, and it's written right up front. And I stated that it's written following that deed of executory trust that the county is obligated to, agree to, promise to do. I really appreciate our commissioners we have now, that they are following what happened in the past, because I really do believe, and honoring that, because I do believe that having worked for the county, there's a large turnover. And I think all the requirements that are in that plan, people are in the deed and in the grant language, it's forgotten after a while. So I appreciate bringing that back to the, light of day, and that the commissioners are honoring that, and that, the public works and the parks folks are looking at that and honoring that. So I think that is huge. And I think people keep that in mind. And just like you said, the preserve is a preserve. It's like a refuge. It's like a sanctuary. And it really is, it's not, I don't feel it's taken away anything else in other areas for people to be out in recreation or enjoy nature, with dogs for, biking or kite surfing or clamming or crabbing, that this area should be, this little postage stamp piece should be set aside for nature and appreciated for that. And I think that's big.
What is it, like a vision without a plan is just a wish, or a dream without a plan is just a wish, or whatever it is that saying is. But I think it's also like a plan without a budget is just paper planning. Yeah. So I think that, having a management plan is awesome, but it only is really impactful if there is resources given to that plan. And right. So like, I would hope that a plan like this, if not this exact plan, could be adopted for Deer Lagoon and other preserves. And like you said, there could be resources given to this place, like a ranger, right? But that requires funding. It's like, right. And it has to be in the best interests of the county and the population, which I believe it is, because, Island County residents value nature. Island County residents moved here because of that, right? Or stayed here because of it. Like, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, right? We either stayed here and moved here because we love the beauty of this place. And so to keep it, we have to protect it, and then we have to budget accordingly.
And I think I saw that in a lot of the comments that came out of the comp plan that put out there for public, comment and tick surveys, is that people, mainly the highest percentage, I think, was people wanted to walk in nature. They wanted to have the ability, didn't talk about dog walking, didn't talk about doing these other things, they talked about walking in nature. And I think that's, that's huge. That really is the big point here.
Well, thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate you taking the time to write this plan and taking the time to speak with me. And I hope that the next time we chat, this plan will be adopted and in action.
Let us hope. And I got to say, thank you, Amanda, and thanks, Ween, so much for everything that you guys do. We wouldn't be the same island if it wasn't for you guys. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Another man up in the pulpit in the state house, head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud, externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit, and kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs, running backwards to just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To Ween's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp.
There's a war being waged back at the workplace. Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Stepping out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story, recoupling emotion, slow motion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old religion or the code